Hi, Stuart here. Today we're going to talk about the relationship between business requirements and domain-driven design. This presentation comes out of a lot of feedback I've gotten on my YouTube channel that says, okay, I get domain-driven design and I've watched videos on gathering business requirements, but how do the two things glue together? Well, we're going to cover that today. But before we do that, we're going to just take a quick spin back through some key concepts in DDD that are going to be relevant to what we're going to talk about. And I'll also point you at 3 of my previous videos that have additional content, including the full Domain-Driven Design Masterclass, which is free on YouTube for anyone to watch. So Eric Evans came up with this concept, and he came up with a bunch of key vocabulary, but for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to focus on domains, models, ubiquitous languages, context, and bounded context. And we're going to talk more about how that all fits together in a little bit. Just as a reminder, here's the full DDD Vocabulary and Relationships diagram, and this is a diagramming guide, and you can stop the video and look at this, but you can also find it in his book, and you can find it in the DDD Masterclass as well. I thought I'd provide it here just to make sure that you have some context for what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about journey mapping. Journey mapping is one of my favorite ways of eliciting business requirements from non-technical business users. And it focuses on that old adage that users have goals, but developers have tasks. And that impedance can make it hard to translate business requirements and take them and make a system that makes sense. And that's the problem that Eric Evans visualized and came up with domain-driven design to overcome, how to deal with that impedance, and then how to once you've dealt with that, make software systems that are capable of evolution. They're maintainable, they're modular, they're all of those attributes that as architects and developers and designers we love, and it's that process. So today we're going to mostly focus on the left-hand side, which is journey mapping, but we're going to touch on how that connects to DDD, and hopefully this will be the glue between this presentation and the full DDD tutorial, between the process of user business discovery and domain-driven design that gets us architectures. So I'm going to pick on journey mapping because that's the one I happen to like for eliciting requirements. But in truth, if you have a technique for eliciting requirements from your business users, from your stakeholders, and it works, use it, right? But just make sure that as you use it, that you make sure that the ingredients that we're going to talk about in the context of journey mapping are also present. Because those ingredients mixed together are then the glue for domain-driven design, which results in better architectures, better systems that are made faster, that are made cheaper, that are easier to maintain, and get all the benefits of DDD. Okay? So I love journey mapping. I'm going to talk about journey mapping. But if you have something else, by all means use it. I don't want to be particularly pedantic about how user requirements are captured, other than I want to call out some elements that, in my experience of doing this for a really long time, are indispensable, and particularly those things that feed the elements of domain-driven design that we talked about a few minutes ago. Here's the thing. Normally in the process that myself and my compatriots follow, we typically schedule a workshop. And what is a workshop? A workshop is a dedicated period of time during which the participants promise that they're going to focus on requirements discovery, documentation, and elaboration. And that means that they're not going to get pulled away, that they're not going to have attention deficit disorder, and that they're going to focus on getting this done, right? A workshop is a promise that we're going to be isolated, that we're going to work on that. And ideally, workshops happen away from whatever the main shop is, whether that's at the customer or if you're a consultant like I am, that we can get the team into isolation, slide pizzas under the door or whatever else is needed, and just focus on it. And the other question I get asked a lot is, how much time does it take to do a really good workshop? So the short answer is, for medium-sized business systems, typically you do a 1-2 week workshop, and usually you're doing a workshop, you're doing 8 to 10 hours a day. You want to bring food in. Again, you want a facility with lots of whiteboards and lots of wall space. You want those giant Post-it notes. You want different color markers. You want whatever, a projector, you want whatever tooling you have, because you want to be totally focused on that. But the flip side is, if you're going to do 2 weeks, they should be 4-day weeks. That is to say, there should be a day in reserve, typically a Friday if you're going Monday to Friday. I'm not saying you have to. You could go Wednesday to Wednesday or whatever. But you should do 4 days of requirements discovery and then a day to do a receive, which is to stop and ponder what you've collected, write down lists of questions to help refine what you've learned so far, make some drawings, write some stories, make lists of vocabulary, and we're going to talk about that a lot, and etc., right? You want a day where everybody separates and you all collaborate, but apart, on documenting what you've learned. And then you come back the next week and you start off with the question and answer, and you drill down into that as much as you need. And then you make some decisions that say whether or not we have to decide something right now, or whether or not we can do it during the delivery. So here's some classic thing that you can kick to the curb a little bit. The technology selection, you can kick to the curb. You can say, as part of your journey mapping, your workshop, you can say, look, what kind of technologies do you guys already have? What do you use? What are you comfortable with? What do you, right? And collect that information, but you can defer the individual decisions about which of those pieces you're going to use or not use a little later down the line. A lot of that will emerge after you're done kind of with the 80% point of doing the architecture as part of DDD. And some of the choices will become obvious and some of the choices will become contentious, and then you can work that out. And the other question I get asked a lot is, well, you know, what should we have as a realistic expectation for project cost estimation? And my answer is, it is incredibly rare that we get more than 60 to 80% big picture, high level requirements and journeys and user stories and, you know, key business processes. And so you should estimate that. Typically, I take whatever I end up with as an estimate and multiply it by 1.5. But if there are other factors, right, I adjust. And I've made some other videos on estimation. There are great estimation videos out there on YouTube, you know, by very respected people. You can go read about that. But let's just set the expectation that if we hit 60 to 80% of the big picture requirements, we're probably right on. And when we go to estimate and size the project, if the project is going to last longer than 9 months, for every month in excess of 9 months you think it will take to take the very first version into production with real users, you should subtract 10% of your confidence. And yes, that means if your project ends up being 18 months long, you have 0% confidence in delivery. But study after study after study after study after study after study after study says, unless you are NASA right, or somebody like them, that your chances of hitting a production system get substantially worse if it's 6 months or less or 11 months or more. 9 months turns out to be perfecto for a medium to medium large business system. And it's important because if you get into doing the workshop process and you get to the end of that second week and everybody's gone away, they're getting on planes, they're getting in cars, whatever, and they go away and they take the next week and they diagram things and they estimate things and they start on DDD, and the BAs start on grooming and refinement and sizing and all those other activities, and then you give it another 2 weeks and you come back with a proposal. So that's a typical 30-day, right, workshop cycle. The end of 30 days, everybody knows enough to take a stab at what it could be. So just some reality checks there about how this process is important. And if you have a workshop and it's constantly interrupted, people have to go away for another meeting, or they're spending time on their phones and not spending time communicating, or whatever, your chances of successfully understanding the requirements enough to estimate it and execute it drop dramatically to zero very quickly. So what it means is you need executive sponsorship of enough altitude that tells the workshop team on all the different stakeholders that they have permission to push back hard against anybody who wants to steal their attention during the workshop period. And if you don't get that, you're just not going to succeed. As we go along, we can start categorizing what we're collecting, right? And let's take a look at, here's kind of a sample sort of story card or worksheet thing. I typically just use an ordinary piece of A4 or 8.5 by 11 for those of you in imperial units. And, it's not uncommon for us to pre-print at least one of the sides with this template. And we go through and, these can be binderized, right? And we go through, and as we're listening to different user journeys and we're drawing diagrams, we're trying to organize them into this. And you may have a requirements management system or a software lifecycle development system like Jira or Azure DevOps. And if you do, by all means, use those as your organizing force. But there is some value in just going with paper for a while. When I go on a workshop, I often take a couple of, travel tubes of a 3.5-inch diameter, 4 foot or 3 3/4 foot long travel tubes, the kind that are indestructible that you can have as checked baggage or that exactly fit into the overhead bin and carry on. And I put, the Post-it note roll in one, and I put a bunch of these worksheets in the other one, and it's not uncommon for me to come back. Also, in the days where these cell phones have fantastic cameras, there are a bunch of really good free phone apps. I like Microsoft Lens to take pictures of whiteboards and so on, and they do a great job of making those really crisp and clear so you can take them home and hand them out to people and have them keyed into your lifecycle management system. But, sometimes those electronic tools slow you down. So, and the one thing you want to realize is that every single minute of a workshop is indispensable. And those little hallway conversations, or you've gone off to the refreshment center, you're getting yourself some beverages and snacks, and you're standing around with some of your peers, and one of the stakeholders is musing about something, and the fact that you can quickly just capture that, right? You don't have to carry your laptop everywhere and, perch it while you're trying to key it in, right? Is something worth considering. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying a hybrid approach generally is what we do. when we do these projects, and there's a lot to be said for having the mobility to be able to whip out one of these pieces of paper and put some notes on it and put some thoughts on it and put some notes into what's related and, make a list in the attachment sections of some diagrams you think we probably ought to write. And so, there is something still to be said for paper whiteboards and cell phone captures above and beyond the use of a software management tool. I'm not saying those things are bad. I'm saying they're indispensable for successful estimation and delivery. But what I am saying is that, anything that slows you down during the workshop process, where your stakeholders you're going to want to, coax them into reveals and storytelling and focus on things and decide what, you want to put a pin in and talk about later, or what we can decide later. A lot of the virtue of a really good workshop coordinator is that lifetime of knowledge that says, I know this is an area we can put a pin into and come back later, and it won't manifestly impact the sizing of the system. It won't manifestly impact the business value that's delivered. I know I can put a pin in that, right? And come back to it and do a mini workshop, like a half-day discovery or something. We're going to talk about identity and access management for half a day once the project is started. We're just going to assume that we have it. It's a constant cost item in our estimation or whatever. So we have some indispensable things that we want to capture during this journey that factor into ADD. The first is, for each story or journey or narrative or whatever your methodology calls for, you want to assign a unique identifier. It doesn't matter what the unique identifier is, as long as it's unique and an identifier. Unique being the important thing. A title is nice. And then the real value comes with categorization, right? So you can see I've got the letters from the previous slide, A, B, C, D, E. And you can see that on the card staple that I normally use, the first categorization is it's a functional, non-functional, or other. There's typically an area. An area is going to correspond to a subsystem, which potentially could be one or more domains in domain-driven design. I'm going to make sure I know who the business unit is, who is my requirements giver, who is my stakeholder. Is it a cross-functional thing like InfoSec or DevOps, or is it the particular business unit like accounts payable that, that's my subject matter expert pool, and I want to capture that so I know who to go back to. At some point towards the end, we're going to want to start ranking these, and the ranking is a function of both predecessor and successor relationships, right? These things have to get done first. And the importance to the business. So, this is where you'd start making judgments about, non-negotiable, absolutely required, must have, and then you get nice to have and stretch. And so you could use a numeric ranking system, and eventually when you get it into your software development lifecycle management tool, they'll probably use a number. But when I'm doing the workshop, I typically just go A through E in the rank, right? A is non-negotiable, got to have it. E is a stretch goal. Parenthetically, it would be really cool if it did this, if we had the time and money. And then some sort of indicator, and I almost always use a %, but you can use anything you want that says, for this thing, right, this journey, story, or whatever you want to call it, we feel like it's some level of confidence. I've seen other teams give them, A through F, letter grades. Like, this is an A story. We totally clearly get this. It's got lots of diagrams. It's got lots of narrative. It's got, stuff. And the number one thing that I look for when I look for that is, acceptance criteria. If the acceptance criteria is, it does a thing, for a guy, no. But if the acceptance criteria is in bullets and somebody from, use a developer or a QA, somebody technical looks at that and goes, yeah, I could write a test to see if that was true, right? It's testable, right? We've talked before in talks about goals being SMART, and you can go look at my series on how to be a good leader, a good architect, good whatever, and you can go read up on SMART. But, acceptance criteria absolutely positively have to be SMART. And bullets are a good sign of smartness, and vague soft verbs, adjectives, and adverbs are a sign that it's not anywhere near ready to be used by anybody. So, these are the indispensable elements. And we're going to talk about how these map on to domain-driven design. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who is a successful workshopper who collects requirements for the purposes of sizing, architecture, delivery, etc., who wouldn't agree with 80 to 90%, right? And they may say, well, there's these 4 other things that I can't live without, right? Perfectly valid. I'm saying this is the minimum set to flow into DDD, right? There may be other tangential requirements, but this is about how, as an architect, I take these inputs. I often do workshops, right? I take these inputs and I turn them into domain-driven design, and then turn that into architecture, and then help a team deliver that into production, because that's what we do, right? We take stuff off the whiteboard and we stick it into production. That's, if you want to, people ask me, like, what's a software architect do? Well, that's a 1-sentence definition. I take people's needs off the whiteboard and I put them in to production as running code. And that's the 80 to 90% use case. The 10% use case is we get through this workshop, we realize that one of 3 things is true. One, we have requirements that are in absolute conflict with each other. Generally, because you have requirements that, for in the categorization D, the business units, where you have battling business units, and they simply don't agree. You cannot deliver a subsystem if that's true. You can't deliver a system if that's true. So at that point, you got to stop, and you generally have to re-workshop. One of the things you got to be aware of is that they could be in violent agreement with each other. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the glossary. But they could genuinely be in disagreement with each other. And that is a lost cause. That's completely hopeless. The second thing that you need to be aware of that becomes blazingly obvious as you start to do the DDD process is what I like to call insert magic here. That somehow there's this business process over here, and it's got a flow and a termination, and there's this other business process over here, and it's got a flow and a termination, and you're supposed to be able to go from this process to that process, except there's nothing that's connecting them. The terminal state of process number 1 is not the beginning state of process number 2, and there is no other process that fills that gap. That's insert magic here, and it's fatal. Right? At the very least, you got to go back and go, how does this happen? What are the rules? The third thing is that you go home at the end of the workshop, and you may get the sinking feeling in your stomach after the first half hour of the first day, but you get together with your team, and you put all these things in a pile, and you go, no way in hell. Things are incomplete. Things are vague. Good indicators and proofs of that is you go to start to build a glossary. Again, more about that later. You go to start building some domains and contexts and bounded contexts and shared contexts, and you go, oh, this is hopeless. You go and you see that you have, things where it is unclear whether or not this thing named foo and that thing named foo are the same or different. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But those are three, your workshop ended in a fail. And of course, coming back with nothing, that would be, I know my boss would go completely Red Queen if that ever happened, because it's professionally inexcusable, right? But if you were in an internal group, I've actually seen people do a 2-week workshop, and I'm a consultant. I'm just sitting in the room trying to facilitate. And at the end of 2 weeks, we have no idea what the system is supposed to be. And so we have no ability to do architecture, no ability to do estimation, no ability to do planning, no ability to articulate to the powers that be, the stakeholders, the ones that are going to write a check for this thing, that are spending the corporation's, hard-earned money. We have absolutely no way to prove to them that we have something that makes any kind of sense at all. I went through one project that had for a big fancy law firm, and we went through three over a 3-month period, 3 workshop cycles, 2 weeks of workshop, 2 weeks of heads down, 2 weeks of workshop, 2 weeks of head down. And we got to the end, and we went to present to one of the managing partners, who was going to be the nice lady who was going to sign off on this. And she said, why in the heck would we even want a system that does that? And I look over to the stakeholders who summoned us, and I went, your ball. Because, she thanked and excused us and said, send us an invoice for your time. I'm really sorry. And then she said, would you please leave the room now? And then I don't know what happened after that, but I think it was bad, is what I'm saying. Again, not typically our fault as an architect, but, somebody should have known. I was brought in at the last minute, parenthetically. Somebody should have known after the first workshop cycle process that this wasn't a viable and useful thing for the business we were serving. And this is where some knowledge of the vertical that you're serving is handy and useful. I'm just saying, not for nothing, I've seen workshops end like that. So, here's the journey mapping discovery cycle. It's really, really simple in principle. But what it takes is an iron will to enforce. Somebody who's really good with people management and managing meetings, especially managing up, because chances are you're going, as the facilitator of the meeting, you're either an outsider or you're not of sufficient rank to command people. And so you have influence, but you don't have authority. And there's a whole book called Influence Without Authority that will help you do that management. But in my experience, people either have that ability or they don't. If you don't, find someone who does, and you shouldn't be facilitating workshops unless you have that ability. So, it's just this cycle, right? Where, we capture stories and we make diagrams, and then we pull out the common words and features and we update the glossary, and then we go back and we correct the stories to use the glossary element and we review. Which brings me to, what the heck's a glossary? And why does it seem to be so pivotal in this journey mapping and discovery cycle? So let's start with just what a glossary is. A glossary is a list of the common term, both technical and business, that the project will use in all of the project artifacts, which means all the user stories, the bugs, the diagrams, everything. We're going to call this thing this name and only this name. And if you go looking like a dictionary, I've seen people build glossaries that look like dictionaries, and I cringe, okay? Because a dictionary, if you go look up something, you can say, well, there's like 20 different things for what this word is or more. And that's great for a dictionary. That's the purpose of a dictionary, right? To give you all the different ways this word or phrase is used. But a glossary has got a special rule. A glossary is a dictionary where there is only one and only one definition for each entry. So here's an example. You have the workshop. And you meet with accounts receivable, and you meet with accounts payable, and you meet with inventory, and you meet. And the word order, you circle the word order in a lot of the stories when you're going through looking for that vocabulary. And it dawns on you that participant A's use of the word order means this, and participant B's use of the word order means this other thing, this completely different thing. And in your head, warning Will Robinson should be heard. And that's when you make a new phrase as a disambiguator. So, in your glossary, you may very well have the word order. We'll talk about that in a minute. But really, the unique operation or process or artifact, in this case, it's a data structure, purchase order, and sales order. Notice the use of hyphenation here. And that's kind of the industry standard way of doing it if you're doing it in English, right? You disambiguate the root thing in order, which abstractly means an instruction to perform, into purchase order, which is, I want to buy this from you, and sales order, I am selling this to you. Those are two different things. And so there are rules for maintaining the glossary. If you rename something from, say, order to purchase order and sales order, you remove the definition, and then you put in links to the new definitions. If it's split, like order is being split into purchase order and sales order, then you remove, you leave the old entry order, and then you say you remove the definition, and you say, look, as a disambiguation, see purchase order or sales order. They're different. Avoid common nouns unless they're hyphenated. Right? Don't use order. And how does this fit into DDD? This should be very familiar to those of you who've watched the DDD videos. What we're talking about in building the glossary, where every entry should have only one and only one definition, is a ubiquitous language in DDD terms. Why ubiquitous language? So when we say sales order, everybody and their marmoset knows what we're talking about unambiguously. And if somebody is in a meeting and they say the word order, you call time out and you say, we're in a meeting to talk about sales orders. Is this an aside about purchase orders, or is this specifically about sales order? And if it is, could we say sales order just so we don't get confused? Pretty please. We must have a ubiquitous language before we can model anything. We must have a ubiquitous language for the user stories, journeys, diagrams, and all those other artifacts on the business side to make even a shred of sense. We need a ubiquitous language in order to estimate, because a purchase order and a sales order are different, and they're probably part of a different subsystem, and they may end up getting built by different teams that have different resources and have a different cost. Journey mapping intersects domain-driven design at the boundary layer, the shared context of a ubiquitous language as expressed by a glossary. And why do we say glossary and not dictionary? Because there's special rules about glossaries you never break. So on the left side, we have stories and flows and diagrams and all kinds of great things. And on the right side, we're going to start to build out domains and contexts and entities and models. And in the center, the unifying force between the business side and the DDD side is that ubiquitous language in the form of a glossary. And if we have that, then we, the architects, designers, and developers, can take those elements from the stories and from the diagrams and so on and start using our DDD analysis techniques that are talked about in Eric Evans's fantastic and revolutionary book, and start building out the domains. In the process of building out the domains, the context, the entities, the models, everything else, then everything else about the abstract architecture falls into place. And as we end up with an abstract architecture, we can start to make that a concrete architecture by cherry picking the technologies, models, approaches, and patterns, right? But without that, if we're missing that ubiquitous language, there's not a hope in heck that we're going to be able to deliver this system. None. So here's the cascade, right? We're going along in these meetings, and we're collecting nouns and verbs and, things for the glossary. We make definitions. And then for the things that represent models, we make models, right? We say, okay, well, what elements does a purchase order have? Well, they say, well, it's got to have a created date, it's got to have a blah, 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 it's got a unique number, it's got to have blah, 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 it's got to have a manifest, it's got to have this, it's got to have SKUs, it's got blah, 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 right? Those get turned into models. And those models get turned into, are grouped together into bounded contexts. And those bounded contexts get grouped together into domains. And then we start eliminating dupes. We had a lot of talk about that last time. We're going to revisit it again really briefly now that we have it in the context of the business side journey mapping procedure. And in those cases, we'll have a shared context. And then we'll start talking about how these things will talk to each other. And that's our events and APIs. And that leads us to an implementation. And I can't say it enough times, make a lot of diagrams. And don't be fussy about them, right? Circles and arrows with a paragraph on the back of each one is just fine, right? That's why I like whiteboard diagrams as opposed to Visio or, one of those. I mean, those are great once you're into architecture and you need really crisp, unambiguous diagrams. But if you're just trying to have a talk with the business about something, don't be fussy. Let them draw it any way they want, as long as you know what it means. And then you go along and you annotate their diagrams, and you say, oh, this is a model, and this is a thing, and this isn't, a process, and this is a... And then you know what you need to drill down into. Let them draw it any way they want. We want to elicit requirements. We don't want to be fussy and get in their way and make them feel dumb for not using the right words. But we do want to get them to just always say purchase order and not order, right? That's a reasonable request. Draw a box with a 30-degree blue in only magenta number 47. No, right? You see the difference? One encourages unambiguous communication, and the other is just being fussy. So let's revisit conflicts for a minute. Because we've got this beautiful idea about bounded context. By the way, business requirements are a bounded context. DDD is a bounded context. Shared context is glossary, right? Ubiquitous language. But now we're down into the domains now, or just context generally, and we have a conflict. The one thing I didn't really talk about last time, and it happens over and over again, and again, the canonical example of this is order really means purchase order or sales order. And the kind of scary thing that I have seen in a couple of projects that got us way down a rabbit hole is the team decided that since the elements of each thing, so they had a model called order, and it had dates and SKUs and blah, 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 blah in it. They thought, well, this is a subset of this other thing. Well, no, because fundamentally the idea behind a purchase order and a sales order is different. So they thought they could make a unified context and bundle that into the same domain where sales orders and purchase orders are in the same subsystem, but they're not. And because they're not, right, from a business point of view, they're just not. If we do something parsimonious and noble, like making them share the same set of models, whether they're in a shared context or not, we've done ourselves a disservice because now we've made it really hard to mutate those things to match the business. So if you end up with contexts that look like an egg, you've probably done a bad thing. And what you probably should have done is say, they should be separate. Maybe they can have some shared elements. That's probably okay. Or not. But, think about that. That's in that 2 weeks after that workshop, right? Where you're, as an architect, you're thinking about, what are the models? What are the actions on those models? I mean, that's what computer science is. It's a Turing machine. And what we deliver are von Neumann Turing machines, right? A von Neumann system is a bunch of Turing machines connected by a network. So the Turing machine is the tape and the instructions on the tape, and those instructions cause a cursor to move back and forth until it reaches a termination condition. And so if you think about it like that, you can see why egg-shaped models are bad, because there's a potential that you don't have one Turing machine here. You have more than one. But if you constrain one to live inside the other one, you make that really hard to change later if you need to. So if you're a C# developer, right? Shared context or interfaces, enumerations, constants, right? All that good stuff. And I've got a little repo with some sample code that I'll continue to add to. I'm trying to build out a full DDD class, but I've gotten started at it. You can go look at it. And so that is my narrative about how you make the translation between the process of collecting business requirements and having the input to be able to start to build out a domain-driven design. Thank you for your kind attention.